I'm Dr. Julie Clark. I'm based at the University of the West of Scotland. I have a long time interest in policy relating to transport, particularly in terms of how it affects us socially and how it affects our well-being. So my interest is in how people move around cities, how they move around in more rural areas, and what that does and doesn't do for them. This particular project, we're looking through a longer lens. It's qualitative work, so based on people's experiences, what they think and feel. That's a particularly useful way to go in that it can give you levers for change. It's not just asking people about what they do right now or what they believe right now. It's giving you insight into a life history as well as just an interview. So it's a really fascinating piece of work from that regard. And while it's not statistically something that you can extrapolate from, it does give you a depth of insight and a potential for change that you can't get from statistical work. So what we've been looking at is, through the lens of older people, what they have done in certain circumstances to decarbonise their transport behaviour, and the goods and the bads of that, what works and what hasn't. So from that, Decarbonate can draw learning about travel policy for particular places that is sensitive to place, and learning about how more widely society may or may not be ready for change. Because as we all know, when you try to force through changes that don't fit with people's lives, it doesn't take you anywhere.
That's good. Very good explanation of your, a summary of the work and your background as well. Iain, a very brief introduction of yourself.
Thanks, Samarthia. So I'm Iain Docherty. I'm Dean of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Stirling. I'm also a transport researcher. I have been for almost 25 years now. I'm really interested in why we get the transport policies we get, and so why we invest in some kinds of infrastructure and some kinds of transport services, and then by definition, why we don't invest as much as we might do in some other alternatives. In terms of the background of this project, some of the things that really interest me are about the disconnection between some of the narratives in the policy process. So at a macro level, we're all well aware of policy imperative to reduce car use for environmental emissions, but also other public policy reasons. But yet, when you come to actually making decisions about what that means in an implementation sense, we often hear in the debate, yes, but cars are more important to people in rural areas than cities, or cars are more important for older people because. And so there's a clear disconnect there between our overall objectives and then what happens in the policy debate. But I'm also increasingly interested in ideas around what social justice really means in terms of transport policy, but also in terms of our inherited carbon consumption, because young people haven't been responsible for most of the carbon emissions that have driven climate change to date. And I think if we try to implement a transition to net zero or beyond, which doesn't ask some pretty challenging questions about those people who've already consumed all the carbon, and I'm one of those, and our responsibility to do more and do faster, then we're really at danger in not achieving a just transition.
Very good. I really like that point about the carbon justice thing you're talking about. Very interesting. Sarah, very quickly, a bit of an introduction about yourself.
Yeah, so my name is Dr. Sarah Swift. I was the postdoctoral research associate on the project. At the time, I was at the University of the West of Scotland. Now I'm at the University of Stirling. Most of my research background has been around dementia and aging. So I was kind of coming to the project from that background of working with older people. But prior to that, I had done some work around sort of sustainability, and I was very interested in relationships with the natural environment. So it was a chance for me to kind of bring those areas of interest together, which was really quite exciting for me. So yeah,
it's made me challenge what I thought I was going to be doing research-wise over the next few years.
Okay.
And it's made me think about a couple of questions that otherwise I might not have had at the forefront of my mind. And they are largely about, I suppose, two things. So one is, what do people out there really hear when we so-called experts or government talk about sustainability and transport and the changes they will need to make in their lives if we're all to meet net zero. Because we think we know what we mean by that, and we think we know what it means in terms of how people's lives will change, but I'm not sure we do know that much about what people hear, what they think about, and therefore what they worry about and what their potential for change is. So that was during the project, that was the thing that struck me most from what we found. Okay. Since then, and this is it's kind of crystallized in my mind watching the debate about the heat waves and the dawning realization on many people's part that actually this is a climate crisis and it's here, it's not in the future. Yeah. Which is that if we move to a policy position where there actually does have to be a lot more rapid change than people had previously assumed, with maybe a degree of coercion in it that they hadn't assumed before. Yeah. How do we get consent for that? And how do we make it happen in democratic societies? And so beginning to understand much better what people think when they hear these messages, and then what they think about what that'll mean for how they have to change their own lives, I think is going to become really important.
I'd actually cluster what we found into 3 different areas. One of them is the theme of needs. One of the themes is possibilities. And the other theme is called assumptions, because I think a lot of what came out was about assumptions. Again, with the benefit of that long lens from our interviewees. Assumptions, we talk particularly in politics as well as policy about drivers, about cyclists, about people who use public transport. They are not separate groups. Very often, most of us are multimodal all the time. You know, most of us will use a variety of modes. But speaking with our interviewees, they go in and out of driving. They go in and out of having 2, 3 vehicles. They go in and out of having one fancy vehicle. They go in and out of not driving at all, of taking up cycling, of trying to walk more. You know, people are far more complex, and we should be very, very wary of making policy on the basis of they won't wear it. People won't like that. There's a lot of other possibilities that, you know, we can talk about and that appear in the research paper as well. The other was, again, a common trope is the need for infrastructure improvements. And anytime we talk about active travel, we talk about cycling, then infrastructure improvements come up again and again. Okay. This is quite reasonable. But one of the things that came out was what our participants were saying is effective enforcement of what is there already. It's enforcement of safer behaviour on the roads. It's enforcement of reasonable parking. So we might think, yes, infrastructure must be improved. But what do we mean by that versus, as Iain was saying, what the general public, if you like, mean by that? We've got a lot of tools already. They're not being enforced.
I think some of the understanding of people's motivations was quite surprising to me. You know, maybe I had an assumption that if somebody had made an effort to switch to an electric car or a more sustainable form of travel, it was because they cared about the environment. Actually, for a lot of people, that's not really the case at all. It might be because of cost. It might just be because it's easier in whatever way. It might be the decision has been made for them by something like medical circumstances. So it just really highlights the need for that complexity of understanding what motivates people and how people could be encouraged. So, especially in the interviews that we did with some of the people who've had experience of decarbonising, I think there is an assumption sometimes that there has to be a big sort of grand, expensive solution. Actually, some of the things that people have implemented that have worked well were just really small, really cost-effective measures that made a really big difference. So there's nothing wrong with kind of thinking small, because those small changes can often have a really substantial impact.
Tell me about something that you found which related to place-based transport decarbonisation.
You know, we're very aware of planning and land use as a central issue. And this comes up again and again for people, effectively for people who are even quite keen to decarbonise, keen to make an environmental contribution. One of the things that comes across is the extent of change that's still required to help them make lower carbon choices and to help it be convenient and realistic. I think moving slightly off of the report itself, we've seen a lot of interesting things over the COVID period, the lockdown period, and the difference it makes when people have to use or are prompted to use more local environments. You know, it's quite easy to make changes if you live in a place where you can go shopping, you can get your education, you can get access to your friends. And COVID has really brought out how critical these local networks can be. But we also want to travel to different places. And to do that, we need choices.
Of course.
And this seems to be missing. One of the phrases that one of our interviewees was in talking about public transport used was about realistic options.
Yeah.
And if you get an app open and say, okay, I want to go here, maybe it will show you some options. Maybe you will look at them and think, it's going to take an hour or 10 minutes if everything runs to plan. And what if it doesn't run to plan? And if you actually know the area, you might go, okay, if that bus doesn't show up, and that's one of the buses that gets pulled now and then I'm waiting for over an hour for the next one. You know, in theory, on paper, these choices are there. They need to be realistic options in practice. And a lot of that is about place.
We had one respondent who, in a passage, started out by saying that he thought the public transport he had nearby to him was actually quite good, but then went to tell us everything that was wrong with it and trying to explain how it was quite good. And to me, what that showed was that actually there's a kind of constant debate in users' minds about whether it is good enough for their uses,
yeah,
and particularly reliability, although people don't often conceptualize it in the same way that we do when we talk about it as a kind of, you know, part of the economic component of investment decisions. If you've got a regular hospital appointment and you're dependent on the bus to get you there, you kind of need that bus to turn up. In a qualitative sense and in an emotional sense, in a way that our models don't capture, frankly. So, you know, I was quite taken actually by the way that some of the, again, you know, the expert debates about modelling and quantitative approaches to the investment versus qualitative ones, you know, these issues were there in everyday decisions that the people that we spoke to were making, and they did, you know, sometimes determine how these people travelled around or whether they continued to use their car or not. So to me, this, you know, kind of reinforced the value of this kind of deeply qualitative work, actually, to give a different perspective and almost a kind of checksum approach to some of these more grander debates about whether our technocratic decision making that Julie talked about is fit for purpose. Because when you listen to the people that we spoke to, you could probably argue it's quite divorced from everyday reality. There's a very noisy, very well organised, very well resourced minority against change a lot of the time. And that sometimes colours the policy system's appetite, to mix my metaphors terribly there, and makes us less ambitious in the scale and rapidity of change that we might actually be able to achieve. We've seen that during COVID with the whole debate in many cities in England about low traffic neighbourhoods, for example, you know, very, very feisty campaigns against them and very well organised. But actually, if you look at the electoral evidence, some of the stuff that political scientists are writing about, pretty well liked by most people doing most things most of the time in their daily lives. So, you know, perhaps the potential for change out there is bigger than we think it is if we can just overcome the noise.
Okay.
And the assumptions.
Yeah, go on, Julie.
Yeah, and the assumptions as well.
Yeah.
Again, the kind of what policy thinks, you know, it's a very, very difficult thing to build a coalition around funding for a new bridge. You can do it, but it's difficult.
Yeah.
It's much, much, much harder to build a coalition and gain funding for keeping cars off of cycle paths, for making sure there isn't glass on them, for making sure pathways are well lit. All these little things that matter an awful lot in day-to-day life.
Yeah. And these are important things as well. Yeah.
Totally. I think, you know, I would argue in many ways they're more important,
yeah,
especially for people who, for health reasons, for age reasons, for family reasons, have to stay fairly locally.
Yeah.
And there's things that are thought of as important and things that are thought of as not important, and that needs shaken up.